Hello, guys, and welcome back to the Figure Forecast podcast with your hosts, Maeve and Scarlet. Today, we have another epic guest in to chat to us all, and we have a little bit of a change in topic today. We are going to go balls deep into the training realm. We have Killian Hamilton on. He is the Director of Programming and Innovation over at Prescript. Myself and Scarlett have both done the Prescript Level 1 course, found it absolutely fantastic. And yeah, we know this is going to be full of knowledge bombs and you guys are going to love it. Killian, welcome onto the podcast. Do you want to introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks so much. Yes, my name is Killian Hamilton. I work as the Director of Programming and Innovation over at Prescript. Big fancy title. I co-lecture with Jordan Shallow in the PSL1 course. I help run labs, and I wrote and I teach a course called Skill Acquisition, which is, a brief description of that course would be, it's a course that's developed around sports psychology. So I think skill acquisition, I'm halfway through teaching it right now. It's a great course in conjunction with the L1 course because it allows you to really meet your clients where they're at in terms of their preparedness to perform. How do they produce, high quality of effort, and how do you keep people adherent over long periods of time? And I know we briefly spoke about the topic of this podcast being like why you're not growing. And I think skill acquisition is a course that seems completely outside that realm. But I think at the end of the day, the stuff we talk about there usually answers those questions about why people essentially aren't growing in the weight room. So yeah, that's what I do in a nutshell, I guess.
Thank you. Yeah, so we did ask Killian on to kind of chat to us mainly about why you're not growing, why you're failing to kind of develop weaker body parts, and like a lot of the issues he sees with females in particular training and why they're maybe not developing their physique in the way that they are trying to work towards. Killian was also quite a funny individual in the lectures. We had a lot of lols, and he definitely pointed out a lot of dumb shit that he sees on the internet. So we're looking forward to hearing some of that.
Yeah, I'll try my best to be funny. I think what makes most of the bullshit you see funny on the internet, or the reason any of it exists, especially in our industry, is because what we do isn't logical. I think it's funny. A lot of people that take the course, you guys, Shallow's a chiropractor. I think this stuff is really important. And, I think calling what we do exercise science is the root of all of our problems, because by calling it exercise science, we think there are these definite answers to these questions. And there isn't. Like, it's not a logical thing any of us do, right? It is rooted in emotion. The reason most of us came into the weight room is an emotional reason. It's not a logical reason. None of us had to train, or else we wouldn't be able to put food on the table. We've invented a narrative, I think, to tell ourselves that. So, when we look at all the bullshit that we see on the internet, and I'm not talking about clamshells or, like kickbacks or something silly that's so obviously silly. I'm talking about like a lot of the smarter stuff that's bullshit, is just because we're the emotion of what we do just conflates these egos, and then we're trying to find the next better answer. I think a lot of people don't grow, or a lot of people come up with nonsense because they're obsessed with just not doing the easiest thing. We all want to struggle to get the result, when sometimes it's just incredibly easy.
Yeah, I literally had this conversation on a call earlier with someone, and it was, she was so kind of consistent, ate the same food every day and kind of approached her nutrition like that. But then when it came to training, she would change it up every month and she'd do this, that, and the other. I'm like, okay, but I'm going to ask you something. If you did the same and stuck to the basics all of the time, what do you think would happen? And it's just, yeah, I think people are always looking for the next best thing and kind of, dumb internet shit.
Yeah, and
I think people.
Sorry. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Scarlett.
I was going to say, do you think that people like will see things that people are doing on Instagram and like their influencers that they might be trying to achieve that look, and then be like, oh well, I need to do that as well, but they can't even squat properly yet. So they're like trying to do all these like fluffy up things when they're not there yet.
I think that's such a big part of it. You know what I mean? Like I don't want to throw, Jordan Peters under the bus here, because I'm not, because I'm an incredibly huge fan. I'm a fan of what he does, I'm a fan of how he trains, but there needs to be some level of like common sense when you watch Jordan Peters train and you go, well, I'm not that guy. You know what I mean? I'm not that guy. I competed in powerlifting for a decade, and I can tell you right now, I'm not going to attempt to stiff leg deadlift 700 pounds. I'm not going to do it because I'm not Jordan Peters. And it should be obvious from watching him. You could listen to Jordan Peters train with the video turned off and just the audio of his like screech sound he makes when he like unracks the Atlantis shoulder press machine, Arsenal shoulder press, sorry. It's like, I don't make that sound when I train. It's probably a good indication I'm not going to ever fucking train that intensity, So exactly, I think on one part, people take in so much information. They take in like bullshit fitness information from fitness influencers that are shredded out of their mind and have no idea how to train. And then on the other hand, and like, that's the entry point. That was the entry point for all of us, like we saw someone who just looked good, was cool, was easily accessible. And then we cared about this and we went, well, I want to go further and learn from someone better. And they kind of like upgrade the influence that they're under. But then they watch the next person who might be smarter, might be better at training, but they're not evaluating where they are in their training career. Like Scarlett said, from a skill standpoint, like, how skilled are you at this? Like, can you execute that movement with a level of movement quality? So there's this thing I talk about in skill acquisition, which is called quality of effort. And this is the sole guiding principle of any, it doesn't matter. I don't do bodybuilding. I'm a track athlete. You guys work in the physique world, but we can all abide by the same thing, which is simply you can design all your training around quality of effort. And quality of effort is the equation between the perceived difficulty of something and the absolute effort that it requires. For example, a barbell squat is a movement that requires a lot of skill to create a high quality of effort, because we see this all the time. We see people who can leg press 400 kilos and they struggle to squat 100 kilos. Well, that would tell you that the squat has a low quality of effort. It's RP9 failure and it's 100 kilos, but they get on the leg press and they can sit there all day with 200 kilos. So the leg press has a greater quality of effort for that individual. Now, this is a great example of Jordan Peters. When we watch him do a stiff leg deadlift, he has a high quality of effort. The relative intensity of the movement that he's training with the absolute intensity of the load on the bar is pretty equivalent. Yeah, he trains to failure with 765 in pounds. And it's like, yeah, looks like he's training to failure with 765. You have a 200 kg male squatting 80 kg and he's struggling, low quality of effort. That's never going to create an environment of adaptation, right? It's never going to create a stimulus worth recovering from. So that's exactly like what you said. People watch influencers, and I think, in calling people influencers, it's important for people to understand that there's a negative connotation to influencer. It's like people point out, I don't know, Joey Shreds is an influencer. It's like, yeah, sure he is, but like I would say I'm an influencer to some degree. Both of you guys are. To be an influencer, you just have to have. Yeah, we all. I'm not an influencer, but it's like, but you are. You're a person of influence. You have a platform, and underneath that platform, you have a scope of influence around other people, and that makes you an influencer. And I think, Shallow got mad at me one time because I said that he was an influencer. Shallow's like, but I'm not an influencer. I'm like, but you are, right? I
can imagine that conversation.
Yeah, he's just so upset. And I was like, wait. Let's think about this. We both are. We all are. Like, even personal trainers at their local gym, they're an influencer. They're a person that you see do something and it has an influence on. And it's like, you get on the internet and we take that title influencer and we immediately just give it to stupid people doing stupid things. But I think, unfortunately, that shakes the hand of smarter people still influencing people in a stupid way. Be the same thing if I went on the internet and did a bunch of stupid jumping and then told a bunch of bodybuilders it was the next best thing for quad development. Like, that's equally stupid. I could come up with a really smart argument. I could break down the physics and the stimulus of it and tell you that it works, but it's not good, you know, and that you're still a person of influence. So yeah, no bodybuilder. I couldn't arm wrestle a bodybuilder into it. But
I feel tired just looking at you jumping.
Yeah.
Yeah, I have a broken toe right now. I told Shallow I broke my toe. I didn't want to stop training, so I traced my foot on a shoebox. I cut the lid of the shoebox off and taped it and shoved it in my shoe, and I just broke my toe further. So it won't be jumping for a while. But no, back to your point, you know, I think people get on the internet and they immediately jump to what we were saying is like the next best thing, or what's said to be the most optimal. But the thing you have to understand about the exercise that might be the best or the most optimal is, like what Scarlet said, is what skill comes along with that, right? Like, can you train that movement with good movement quality, not only for enough volume, enough repetitions to cause stimulus, but at enough load for that exercise to also have a greater impact? Like, there are people out there where the adductor machine will always trump the stiff leg deadlift. And that's fine, because, you know, one thing to note, going back to this idea of like, why aren't you growing, is to understand in hypertrophy that an exercise creates an internal environment for adaptation. That's a really smart way of saying all a movement does in the gym is create a level of stress in you internally that forces your body to change. For some people, that might be a goblet squat. And then for other people, that might be a Smith machine squat. And then for other people, that might be a high bar squat. But all it is it's just a thing that creates a necessary amount of stress that your body feels the need to recover from that experience. So that's where we go wrong with programming exercises, is we, in hypertrophy, everyone right now is obsessed with like, this exercise hits this muscle the best way, and then some other nonsense. It's like, that's not true. That's not what it is. What it is you need an exercise that creates an internal environment so stressful that your body goes, I need to adapt to this experience. And then you guys, what you do amazingly, and why both of you do really well when you compete, is then you go eat the things that you need to eat to recover, and then you sleep, and then you grow. You know, the same workout that you guys do could be executed by someone else, and if they ate 600 calories and stayed up all night and they were out on the tiles, they wouldn't grow. And it's like, that's kind of funny, because that's the confirmation that hypertrophy is a sport about nutrition and recovery, with like this secondary sport of actually training in the gym. And I'm not saying that training doesn't count. There's not good ways to do it, but there needs to be less of an emphasis right now on like the next best lengthened lat movement, and a way bigger emphasis on like, what are you eating?
Yeah. Yeah, I have that when like some people will like come to me and they're like, oh, can I just have a training plan? And I'm like, yeah, but what's your nutrition like? Because like, we need to do the whole thing, otherwise it's not going to work. And I don't think people realize that like they are the foundations, like when it comes to it, 100%. Like,
yeah. And there's a great amount of nuance and detail and thought process that goes into, especially writing programs that are geared towards hypertrophy. The reason being is because when you're trying to simply just put on as much mass as possible, you're going to run into two roadblocks. You're going to run into just accumulating an insane amount of volume in the gym. Or the other thing you're going to do is you're just going to be so redundant in the gym. You're just going to constantly be doing the same thing. And that's why it takes like a lot of thought to write a good hypertrophy program, for those reasons. Either you're just going to do so much volume that you're going to have issues, so you have to make better choices with exercise selection so the volume doesn't cause misuse and just, you know, constant, you know, nagging pain, or you're just going to become so redundant in your exercise selection that like what Maeve, what you were saying earlier is like, you're never going to bring weak body parts up because you're not avoiding the strong ones. So I think I'm not, anytime I talk about hypertrophy, people in the physique world get upset at me because it sounds like I'm making fun of them. I'm not, but I'm saying when you approach hypertrophy, you need to approach hypertrophy with the mindset that hypertrophy is the adaptation. It's not the process. Whereas like you said, Scarlett, clients come up to you and they're like, can you just give me a program to like grow my legs? And you're like, no, I can just give you a list of exercises. But like, that's not how legs grow. You know what I mean? And part and parcel, like I work with a lot of people that, I guess you could file under rehabilitation. Some of those people are bodybuilders as well. And, a constant thing I get is people will ask me, this is my favorite thing. It's happened to me a few weeks ago. People love to DM me a hypothetical question. Hey, have you ever had a client that's had this? And I'm like, probably something similar. Oh, the shooting pain down their left leg. Yeah, sure. What would you do about it? And I'm like, I don't know. I would have to see their program. I would check on these 3 things at their hip. Do they have internal rotation? Do they have external rotation? What's the stiffness of their ankle? Like how strong are their feet? Can they control their pelvis? What's the rest of their program look like? And then people will always go, oh, that client is actually me. I'm like, yeah, I know it is. But you didn't think that would help you. You thought I would give you advice for your client for free. But I'm like, okay, it's you. So like, I need to see your entire program. They're like, oh, like, what would you add to it? And I'm like, I probably wouldn't add anything. I'd probably take away 90% of the nonsense you're doing, And to your idea of like people asking you for a program with no nutrition, people ask me constantly if I can write them something for their hip. Can you write me something, to fix my hip? Can you write me something to fix my back? I'm like, yeah, just throw your entire program out. You're not going to add, like if you've ever played Jenga, the game of Jenga is not about adding more fucking blocks to the tower. It's about taking ones out and stacking them on top, So that's what I think people are missing the mark on. People think that hypertrophy is about training harder and harder and finding better and better exercises. It's like, no, it's probably writing a very intelligent program that allows you to not only recover, but return to the gym with a high quality of effort. And it reduces redundancy and it makes exercise selections that bias weak areas and demote strong areas in terms of their need to recovery. Same thing goes for rehabilitation. Rehabilitation is not do these 3 hip stretches in this one goofy exercise. It's like fire your coach and do these 5 exercises you've never done before, So I think people lose that. All of these things are holistic because we're going after results as if they're processes. Like hypertrophy example, like people get mad at me. I've said it in skill acquisition. I said it in the lab the other day. Hypertrophy is not a controllable variable in the weight room. Like I can't program for that. Anything that looks remotely like programming for hypertrophy. And this is where I think like Jordan Peters does it well. Kuba does it well. Dorian Yates did it well. Mike Menser before him did it even better. All you can control in the weight room is strength. Everything you do in the weight room, hypertrophy is the adaptation because you just did strength both well enough and poor enough that it turned into hypertrophy. And that's kind of the funny part. Like strength is something you can program for, and it's something you can express. And then if you do it long enough and recover from it and eat in a surplus, you get this cool secondary adaptation, which is hypertrophy. But hypertrophy is always a secondary adaptation to something. And I think that's where people go wrong, is if they treated the workouts you guys did like strength workouts, they would eat better, they would recover better, they would train way fucking harder than they do because they realize it's about being strong and not just about accumulating 10 repetitions. Then we would be better off. But yeah, that's the variable you can control as a coach and as a client is it's strength. It's not hypertrophy. Hypertrophy, I jokingly say, is the happy accident that comes from it, but it is. It's the adaptation driven by anabolic environment of sleep, nutrition, and supplementation.
When you talk about like effort, like as a coach, like how would you get someone to apply the right amount of effort? Like, because obviously like that is a skill in itself, isn't it? Like I find that obviously for me, like coming from powerlifting, like obviously I know you powerlift as well, like that 1 rep max is like where you find that intensity of effort. But like if nobody is like ever really done that, like how do they know if they are training hard enough, like to actually get the stress that they need from it when it comes to training? Like how
Yeah,
how do you teach that?
that's a great question. I think that's the question I get the most. So I was over in the UK, it must have been like 2 years ago now, I think, in Rotherham, and I was talking to somebody there about a bodybuilder. I was talking about their training, and I was using RPE. And I'll never forget this moment because this blew my mind. Bodybuilder looks at me and he goes, "Well, I don't train RPE." And I said this on a podcast with Jinty yesterday. In your guys' world, it always perplexes me because I'll bring up RPE. And Scarlet, I know you came from powerlifting, and Maeve, I know you're intelligent, but like the rest of the guys in your industry,
I dabbled.
yeah,
I know what you're
yeah,
talking
there you
about.
go. So it's like I bring up RPE, and then it's like somebody telling you they breathe air and you explaining to them it's oxygen and them getting upset about that idea. And it's like, I don't do RPE, I train to failure. I'm like, do you know that's RPE 10? And the set you did before was RPE 9. The set you did before that was RPE 8. The set before that was RPE 7. It's like you train RPE whether you know it or not, you know, like hello is 58 different words in 58 different languages, man. Like it's nothing to be upset about. But no, I think when it comes to that question, which is the question I get the most, which is how do I teach my client how to train hard enough, or my client's never experienced working hard. How do they know they're working hard and close to failure? The fact of the matter is they aren't training close to failure and they don't know what it feels like. And unless you create the environment for them to try hard as a coach, they never will. So I think trainers get upset a lot of times because they're like, well, my client's not training 1 RIR. I know it's 3 RIR. Or it's like, that's not failure. They had 3 more reps. The thing as a coach you need to realize is they didn't have 3 more repetitions. That was failure to them. And that's okay, because that's where they are in their developmental journey as a client or as an athlete. Is to them, that's failure. They don't have the sense of agency, the belief in themselves to do 3 more repetitions. So regardless if you strap them to the machine and do it for them, they're not going to do it. They don't think they can. The way to create a different approach to this is to understand cognitively where this person is in their development, and to say, okay, this person's, you know, been training less than 2 years. They've never trained consistently. They've never done a program that utilizes a high quality of effort, that utilizes good exercise selection. So understanding that that client is an infant, like is a child that's like 0 to 3 years old. And every decision that client makes is entirely an emotional decision. And not only is it an emotional decision that your clients make in their first 1 to 2 years at the gym, but on top of that, every single thing they do needs to be rewarded for them to ever do it again. And that's the thing I think we lose as coaches, is we forget as coaches that in terms of like cognitive development as athletes, in order to be a coach, you have to be almost entirely cognitively developed inside the sport or industry that is fitness. Like all of us make logical and reasonable decisions about training. And when we're working with our clients, we're very unemotional about that process. That's a sign of being highly cognitively developed, right? You're an adult in fitness. Your client's a child in fitness. They came here for an emotional reason. They train highly emotionally, right? I don't want to do that. I don't like that exercise. Emotion. And then when they get on a machine, they need to be rewarded to try hard, just like a kid. You know, a kid does something good, you reward them, so you hope that they do it again, wash the dishes and so on. Your client's no different. So this is where, you know, beneficial conversations around shortened and lengthened positions of a muscle should happen. And this is actually where they have some of their greatest benefit. Is in a shortened position and in a lengthened position, we get some of the greatest sensory feedback in the exercise. Anybody listening to this, you guys know when you're training in a shortened or lengthened position, in a shortened position, you're getting probably the most the highest amount of quality muscular contraction. You start to feel cramping, you know, high bicep curls and, you know, seated rows, and same thing with lengthened positions. You get on a gym kit explode row knockoff and like you can feel your lats stretch in the stretch position. That sensory feedback enables the reward loop for a person. It enables the reward loop for all of us. You get on a machine, you feel a good stretch, and then every bodybuilder puts their little road mic on and on Instagram says, oh, I picked this move and I feel really good stretch here. Yeah, we get it. That's a reward loop. And everybody, you know, closes it even better by getting on the internet and telling everyone and closing that reward loop next. And then tomorrow they make another video, you know? So we work in these feedback loops of reward or punishment, and your client's the same. So early on, when you want to teach your client how to output effort, we need to put them on machines or in exercises that provide a tremendous amount of sensory feedback, because for your client, there's a good likelihood that feeling something equals working to them. And we can have arguments all day as smart, experienced lifters to say that feeling something doesn't necessarily mean the highest quality of stimulus, but it doesn't matter to your client because they literally need that to ever try hard again. So one way you can create effort in your client is staying away from mid-range movements or staying away from movements that might not either terminally lock out a joint or fully shorten or fully lengthen logistically a muscle group, because they're not going to have the sensory feedback loop necessary to encourage effort. And we can get someone to cramp up, if you can get someone to like feel like the craziest pump they've ever felt, or not be able to lock their elbow out again or their quad again, that's an experience that they're going to save, they're going to retain as a memory of what effort felt like. So when I was first starting as a trainer, and up until the end of the time I worked physically in a gym, the big thing I would do is the first exercise I would ever do with someone is leg extension. I wouldn't assess them. I wouldn't look at how they moved. I would ask them a bunch of questions like, all right, let's go out on the floor, go over to the leg extension, have them do a set of 15 to failure. Give them 10 seconds to rest and go, give me 5 more. 10 seconds to rest, give me 3 more. Keep giving me 3 until you can't give me any more. And they'd be like, oh my God, this hurts. And you're like, does it hurt or is it just uncomfortable? And they're like, oh, it's just uncomfortable. You're like, great, that's what effort feels like. Now, every movement we do needs to feel like the last 3 reps of this leg extension. And it's like, there you go. You put them in an externally stabilized, externally constrained environment. It's an exercise that shortens a muscle group. So they got massive sensory feedback. They built up analactic acid. They were safe the entire time. You teach them effort, and now they can retain that experience, and we can look to find that experience appropriately other places. But it's going to take more than one time on the leg extension. It's going to take a while. But where trainers, coaches go wrong, clients go wrong with effort is early on in their training career, they jump to movements in which the sensory feedback is, you know, I would say the word very muddy. You know, a barbell squat is going to have a ton of muddy sensory feedback. You know, my shoulders are going to feel tight. My low back's going to get a pump. Maybe I feel it in my quads. Maybe I don't. Bad movement to learn effort. Quad extension, we can all learn effort on the quad extension. Hamstring curl with like seated hamstring curl with like a rest in the lengthened position, you're going to feel that movement, right? So these movements do a great job of teaching effort through sensory feedback. And if you think about it, that's how we teach reward and punishment to children, is through sensory feedback. Like when you were a kid, I don't know, when I was a kid, I feel like you guys, when you were kids as well, it's like you got like a candy or somebody hit you. And like you were taught, right? You're taught reward and punishment through sensory feedback, something sweet, or getting hit with a spoon on the back of the head. Or for me, when I was
90s,
yeah, when I was young, my mom and my grandmother. Yeah, when I was young, my mom, my grandmother let me put my hand on a stove that was on, like the steel burner in my Irish grandmother's house. She's like, yeah, put your hand on it. And then I burned my hand, and she went, see, the stove's hot. Now you know. And then up until I was 30, like I never cooked food again. I like got like that pizza thing and like put the pizza in from the living room. I didn't want to be in the kitchen near the oven. But you know, it's so funny because if you want to understand how to train yourself or how to train other people, it's just understanding these stages of cognitive development, because that is your environment for information is your stage of cognitive development. You go through it as a child, And then every time you learn something new, want to learn how to work out, you're going to be a child again and have to grow into an adult cognitively in that specific task. And all of us are, you know, all of us, I say, aren't adults yet in fitness, but we're probably like 18, 19 years old. You know, we're probably still pretty emotional when it comes to something about us, but we can separate the emotion when it comes to other people. And that's what I think is like, that's the sign of a coach. A sign of a coach is somebody who can go in the gym, be entirely emotional about themselves for an hour, but then get on the phone with a client and be like, logically, this is what you need to do. You know, you can separate the emotion outside of that. A child's just going to be emotional all the time, right? We see that with trainers nowadays, especially on Instagram, right? Trainers who get upset at their clients, trainers who get upset that somebody has a different idea than them. Like that's a person that's just not cognitively developed yet, right? They're still in this emotional stage of learning, you know, and then you get old and jaded like me, and you're like, who cares, man? Just train and leave us all alone. You know, like just work out. It's all going to be okay. So yeah, that's what I would say to that. You know, teaching effort is understanding where someone is developmentally, right? And a lot of times there is massive benefit to sensory feedback up into a point, you know, and then logically sometimes there's not. You know, if I was coaching either of you guys, I wouldn't, you know, put all of my ducks into the leg extension and hamstring curl. There's 1,000 other movements that we could do that would be better for numerous reasons. But early on, yeah, you probably need to heavily rely on movements that elicit a sensory feedback loop.
Great. That was great. We do love the leg extension.
I've said so many words. I'm sorry.
So many words. No, it was great. I actually got kind of on the note of sensory exercises in the course. One of the lectures that I really enjoyed, you mentioned hip thrusts, and where yeah. So let's dive into that, because you were kind of explaining why not, you know, maybe the heavy hip thrusts in people's plan are not giving them the hypertrophy payoff that they want. And I think that, yeah, given it as a female podcast, I think everyone would love to hear this one.
Yeah, it's funny. So yeah, in the course, me and Shallow always seem to come up on this hip thrust question, and we use like the glute lecture to answer it. And it's because since we started teaching this course, there has never not been an active debate around the squat and the hip thrust as a movement. And I know the last time I taught the course that just finished, I railed against the hip thrust, and somebody got like pretty upset about it. And then I had to come back. Yeah, it's like I had to do a lecture on like how the hip thrust could be good to quell all concerns. But no, the hip thrust in particular, the heavy hip thrust. So one thing I think I would go back to, and I want to break down the hip thrust argument in a very logical and non-emotional way with you guys, because I just talked about logic versus emotion. And I think if we break this down logically, nobody can get upset about it. Number one, let's understand that people enjoy doing the hip thrust for entirely emotional reasons. Like, let's just all put that on the table. Everyone who listens to this who likes doing the hip thrust, if you like doing the hip thrust, it's okay. Just understand and admit to yourself you do it for entirely emotional reasons. It probably feels really good in your glutes. You can load it more than you can load your back squat or deadlift, which should be a good sign that either your back squat and deadlift are too light and elicit a low quality of effort, or something's wrong with the movement that trains the same muscle groups but can be trained to a massively greater intensity. So that's another kind of like red flag about this movement. But let's break it down like super logically here. Most people, can load an intensity on a barbell hip thrust far greater than they can on a deadlift or a squat. If you can't deadlift and squat the load that you're using in the hip thrust, there's probably a good likelihood that your low back, spine, pelvis, hips, glutes aren't prepared for an exercise of that intensity. Because the other thing to remember is a hip thrust isn't largely externally stabilized in its loaded position. A leg press, a hack squat, all massively externally stabilized in that loaded position. At bottom of a hack squat, regardless of how heavy it is, you have an enormous back pad, you have handles, you have a foot platform. It's very stabilized, and that stability is going to increase your proprioception. That stability of that machine is going to increase your quality of effort because it feels safer, because we have more tactile touch points to create force or counter force through. In the hip thrust, we don't have that. Hip thrust is a largely unstable movement, not unlike a deadlift or a squat, that although it has a shorter range of motion, has the same amount of instability at the pelvis, but we're now loading to an intensity sometimes 2 or sometimes 3 times as heavy as people barbell squat or deadlift. And I see this. I talked to a person a couple of weeks ago, and I got an intake from them, and they had a low back injury and they do hip thrust. And when I asked for videos of squat and deadlift, they said, "Oh, I don't squat or deadlift." Like, how did we get to hip thrust? You had all this time on this other thing. So understanding that the hip thrust is usually trained at an intensity far greater than you've ever expressed the ability to stabilize or to create force or resist force under. The other thing to understand about a hip thrust is it trains the glutes in like a mid-range to maybe shortened position. And I'm going to give you a little bit of mid-range and shortened position. I'm not going to give you any lengthened position of the glute here. So if we break down qualities of a short position versus qualities of a mid-range position versus qualities of a lengthened position, shortened positions of a muscle group under load will elicit a high contractile quality, which creates a lot of sensory feedback. So when you train a shortened position of a muscle, you usually get a really great pump. Thing is, you don't usually apply a lot of mechanical tension because the movement is either unstable, you're not in a good position to leverage yourself to exert a lot of force, or the range of motion is sometimes shorter because you're trying to negate the length in a mid-range position. Mid-range positions of our movement are excellent for loading extremely heavy because mid-range positions are often compound movements in which we're training muscles that either cross more than one joint or we're training a large general selection of muscle groups. So we have more ability to exert force. Lengthened positions apply the greatest amount of mechanical tension. Lengthened positions also always bias the eccentric phase of the movement, which means that training at a slower tempo could be massively benefited in lengthened positions, and you wouldn't need to use as much load in the movement. The hip thrust flies in the face of all of this. The hip thrust loads the pelvis, which if you wanted to look at the structure of the pelvis, is not a stable joint location to apply load specifically to. Your traps is a great place to apply load to. Like your shoulders, for all intents and purposes, being loaded axially into the spine is a very stable place for structure. A barbell deadlift, although axially loaded, is extremely structurally sound to load into. Loading into your pelvis on a sacrum and ilium that move very minute degrees and applying a massive barbell to that specific area and loading into extension, it's just not a stable joint to load into. So that's a problem with the hip thrust. The other problem with the hip thrust is because it's a more shortened movement, it requires a high volume of work, so a high amount of repetitions to train it. And on top of that, a high amount of load. The problem with this is one of the first things you learn when it comes to training is you can have a high intensity or you can have a high volume. You can't have both. And the hip thrust does that wrong, right? If you were to go deadlift, quote unquote, really heavy, do 6 reps or less, 12 to 18 reps in total, go home and rest. People are doing sets of 20 hip thrusts with their deadlift max. And it's like, what is the necessary recovery from a movement like that? Well, it has to be a week's worth of recovery. So by doing a hip thrust at the intensity people do it, they're probably incurring the necessity for recovery akin to an extremely heavy deadlift session or multiple deadlift sessions. So you're asking yourself to need to recover more. You're training a muscle in the shortened position, which is inefficient for muscular tension and maximizing, the amount of work you get out of the set. You're using a far greater load than necessary to cause a stimulus. Whereas if you got good at barbell squatting, you're going to elicit equal or greater results at the glute, equal or greater results at the quad. You're going to be able to train at 50% or even 20% of the volume that you train in the hip thrust with a greater amount of intensity, which, going back to what we talked about earlier, creates the same internal environment for adaptation. And that's what people need to remember. It's not even an argument of, is the hip thrust better or the squat better for stimulating the glute specifically? It's the fact that with far less volume in a good barbell squat, even a good leg press, you're going to create the same internal environment for adaptation that 100 reps of heavy barbell hip thrust will do. And that's something to take note of, is when you're thinking about hypertrophy, you're either thinking about training in a caloric surplus, creating an anabolic environment to grow. If you're dieting down, and this might be where somebody hears me say like, well, if you're trying to grow, maybe the squat's better because it's less volume. And someone's going to go, well, I'm dieting and I want to do hip thrust because it's more volume. It's like, well, wait, you don't necessarily need to do an exercise that's more volume when you're dieting. Keep your nutrition in check. Find exercises that allow you to fail appropriately, and then just do 1 or 2 more exercises. It's, you know, if you want to create an internal environment for adaptation, your glutes don't know it was a hip thrust or barbell squat. They know it either took 25 reps or it took 100 reps. And it's like, that's what your body knows. And I think that's the thing for people to remember, right? And that's why, you know, oftentimes some of these, you know, extreme low volume approaches work well, is because it gives people the room to recover. The hip thrust doesn't give anyone any room to recover. And the other thing the hip thrust does wrong, the last thing I'll say, so not only is it a movement that needs too high of a volume to create stimulus, it requires too much intensity. Those two things can't occur in the same movement at the same time. The next thing it does is it teaches really poor motor patterns in the lower body. So something you guys will know who have trained heavier barbell, competed at heavier barbell sports, is that when you deadlift, your knees lock out at the same time or slightly before your hips. You never lock out your hips with these bent knees. Everyone who trains a massive volume of hip thrusting in their program goes to show you their deadlift. They stand in that like goofy A-frame stance. Every girl, every woman who does hip thrust goes to go deadlift, and then they stand with their legs too wide. And when they deadlift, their knees are bent and their hips lock out. And I'm sorry if that hurt your feelings, and it's you who's listening to this, but it is you, and you're deadlifting wrong. And because you're deadlifting wrong, you're not getting anything out of the deadlift, and it's confirming your argument that hip thrust is good. But the hip thrust has just taught you poor motor pattern of the lower body to actually get anything out of these better movements. So I also don't like the hip thrust because people do it at such a high volume that it encourages a motor pattern that doesn't allow them to scale their workout. So over time, when they can no longer hip thrust 300 kilos, and they have to move on to actually deadlifting, they're going to need to start all the way back from the beginning when it comes to learning how to deadlift. Whereas this person just biased a lot of hinging in their program, they probably would have created the same internal environment for adaptation, required less recovery, and learned motor patterns that can be scaled and progressed for a longer period of time.
Yeah, amazing.
I hope that's a logical explanation. It's not meant to hurt. It's not like a Brazilian study into like which Brazilian woman with the biggest ass got the most out of an ass exercise. Like they all did. They were all winning when they got to the gym, you know? So it's like, it's just a logical argument, right? Like if you asked any of your clients, do you want to do 100 reps of this or 20 reps of this? It's the exact same. I personally am doing the 20 rep one. I don't want to do the 100 rep one. That sounds like way more work.
You're a powerlifter, of course. That's the answer.
Yeah, exactly. Is there anything I can do for 3 repetitions, you know? But yeah, you know, and like I don't coach bodybuilders. I've never competed at bodybuilding. Have I consulted with people that do bodybuilding work in the physique world? A ton. Rehabilitation, programming. I've taught L1, which is taken by tons of bodybuilders. And, you know, I would say the one thing in that sport that I would encourage people to think about more logically is I even think about this in terms of training myself or any of my clients, but I would especially think about this in a sport that's really governed by calories and recovery, is that I would constantly be trying to write a program that more efficiently uses energy to create adaptable stress. Because if you're in a surplus or if you're cutting and you're in a deficit, if you're getting ready for a show and you're prepping, if you're enhanced or unenhanced, you know, you should be going into workouts thinking to yourself, I have this much energy to pull from. Like, this is the gas tank I have today. This is the fuel source. I'm not trying to use it all up. You know, if I want to grow, I want to maximize the amount of stimulus I create in the gym, but while using the least amount of energy possible, right? Like, that would be my goal. Like, do I want to eat 6,000 calories or do I want to eat 4,200 calories? It's like, much rather eat 4,200 and get the same effect from it. And that's probably going to come from choosing exercises that don't waste energy so much. This is why I think shortened and lengthened exercises have exploded in bodybuilding recently. They require, although a ton of effort, far less global energy. You know, you're not going to see people training like they did in the, you know, I would even say 90s, where it's like compound movement dominant. It's exhausting. The need for recovery is so much higher. You're going to be eating more. You're going to be supplementing to a more extreme degree. Where it's now, it's like there's smarter ways to do it. We can be way more efficient with our distribution of energy, especially in a deficit, you know, and we can create a stimulus, because that's all we're looking for is stimulus. And then we can go recover from it. And I think people need to approach, you know, training more economically with the energy they have available to them, especially in the hypertrophy world, because it's hard to manage that energy, right? You do a couple movements and you eat so many calories, and like, I'm sure you guys have been through it. I don't even do that, but in the workouts I do, like, I'm already hungry, and I'm like, if I'm already starving, you know, I'm not eating enough. Like, yeah, I did a master's track meet a month ago, and I was training, you know, 2 to 3 times a day, and the amount I would have to eat and the volume I would train would go way down. Like, what I did in the weight room was negligible compared to what I used to do, because on top of, you know, sprinting and jumping, I didn't have the gas tank to do any more lifting. It's not that I didn't have the energy. I like physically didn't have the calories. You know, there would be days where I would drop 5 or 6 pounds just from running in the sun, lifting, and like just not being able to eat that volume of food to stay at the weight I was at. So I think in the physique world, we need to look at these exercises that are just energy vampires. Hip thrust is an energy vampire for everybody who does it. It's like there is a smarter, better, easier, less loadable way you can do the same thing, because all you're trying to do is signal your body that it needs to recover. That's it.
Yeah. You're obviously a squat and deadlift fan, and I think a lot of people listening to this are going to be one side or the other. There's people that will squat and deadlift, and then there's the other camp that are no squats, no deadlifts, sticking to your waist, all that kind of argument. What are your thoughts on that?
So I really rail against having like an ideology. And I think the problem with a problem I see in our industry is we subscribe to like a camp. Like, we join a tribe of people who do it this way, and therefore the other way it can't be done. You know, so we have the big compound squat and deadlift team, and then you have, you know, the young team of don't do any of that and just get on these machines. And it's like, all right, wait a minute. What we need to do is we need to better evaluate the utility of the exercise we're doing. The problem with like the squat and deadlift team is that they see everything as like derivative of squat and deadlift, and like, these are our best options because they do the thing the best. Well, they don't. They do a thing the best. Same thing with machines, you know. And I think if we were able to understand that better and just evaluate the utility, and when I say modality, I mean the movement. Like, what is the exercise? The exercise is the modality, or the tool you use. A barbell, a dumbbell, or a machine is a modality. It's like, you need to be able to assess that. You need to be able to go, what is the qualities of a barbell? What does it provide me in training? Is there a utility for that in my training? Well, what does a big compound movement like a squat or deadlift provide us? Tremendous amount of energy exertion, right? So in a surplus, in a deficit, we're going to be able to, you know, really tap into something that creates a lot of energy expenditure when we do a compound movement. Great. We're going to be able to load compound movements heavier than we can load anything else practically over time with good skill. What does that elicit for us? Well, in the general muscle groups we're trying to train, it's going to elicit a massive amount of stimulus very quickly. And that's the thing people need to remember about squatting and deadlifting, or anything to do with the barbell, is because you can train it at a very high intensity, you can get that necessary amount of stress for adaptation. You can create a need for adaptation rapidly. With a barbell, it's going to take longer in an externally stabilized machine. You know, you can create an environment for adaptation with a barbell with one repetition. One max effort deadlift is going to create an internal environment where your body's like, that's it, we're done. You got to go to bed, you got to eat, and that's it. That's very quick. Now, is that great for hypertrophy? Maybe not, because we need a frequent and constant exposure to stimulus, but we can still elicit a need for adaptation very quickly. So including heavier compound movements in your program is going to be the guarantee you've elicited a need for adaptation. Then these other more biased or isolated movements begin to direct the adaptation. So your barbell movement or your heavier compound is going to elicit the need for adaptation. What you do with hamstring curls and leg extensions and, you know, these more isolated movements, that begins to direct where the adaptation goes, because your body understands there's a need for adaptation. You're now telling your body the main adaptation we need is here, not over there. And that's where people go wrong with compound movements, is they just build these generally muddy, redundant physiques because they don't spend enough time doing these things that work in isolation. Or people take this approach to their training, which I'll never understand. I think everyone needs to realize this. A balanced approach is a bad approach. If your workout program is perfectly balanced, it's the worst program I've ever seen. Like, if you want to grow your hamstrings and I look at your program and I can't tell that's the goal, that's a bad program. If you want to grow your hamstrings and there's 3 quad movements in there, your hamstrings aren't going to grow. It's like squat, deadlift, then only do hamstrings. You know, maybe do a little rear foot elevated split squat to keep your hip flexor feeling good, to, you know, keep your quads generally strong. But it's like, there isn't a benefit to taking the squat deadlift approach. There's not a benefit to taking the avoidant of squat deadlift approach. It's understanding the benefits of both. You know, big compound movements, squat and deadlift do a number of things. They create an internal environment for adaptation. They require a tremendous amount of energy expenditure. They make you stronger. And if you go back to what we talked about, strength is the controllable quality in the weight room. It's not hypertrophy. Hypertrophy is the consequence. So it's like, as coaches or as athletes, your aim should be to be stronger. And that strength creates room for hypertrophy, right? That strength in the squat is going to create room for you being better at all these accessories that you want to do. So they're not massively underloaded. So I think it's just understanding the utility of those things, right? You know, more biased movements are probably going to direct stimulus better, but they probably won't elicit stimulus to the same way a heavy compound movement might. So I think they just need to work in unison with one another. I also think long-term, people who don't take the time to improve their skill in the barbell movements limit their ability to train. Now, if everywhere you ever travel to somehow has a fully outfitted ultra flex gym, that must be really nice. But I've traveled a lot in my lifetime, and I often end up at gyms that have absolutely dick all for equipment. Where I train now it's like a CrossFit gym. It has barbells and it has dumbbells. And I train there because the guy who owns it's my best friend, and I have a key to it. So I get to go when no one's there, and it's the best. But the sacrifice is I don't get any machines to train on. Imagine if I didn't know how to squat and deadlift. What would I possibly do at a gym like that? And I see this all the time with clients. They'll be like, my goal is hypertrophy, but all I have is barbells and dumbbells. And it's like, yeah, that's fine. Yes. The problem here is you. Like, you're the problem. You're not good at any of these movements, right? And we get that now. You know, I think it's a disservice to adults to put them into a position where they could possibly be like physically helpless in the gym, where they go in and they're like, I have no idea what I can do today. There's only barbells and dumbbells. It's like, that's step one. That should be like the first thing you learn. And then you keep it in your back pocket. You're like, well, if the power ever goes out and I only have barbells and dumbbells, I can still train and I can still put on, a decent amount of muscle mass. So yeah, I think, there's utility in all of these modalities. Putting too much time into any of them is detrimental. Putting too much time into barbell bench, squatting, and deadlifting is equally as detrimental as only ever sitting on machines. It's not the more moral route to go at all.
When you said, when someone's trying to bring up a particular body part and, you're looking at the program and you can't immediately tell, what would you say, like, with that are kind of the biggest mistakes or you know, things that you've seen being done wrong when people are trying to grow very specific areas?
Yeah, so the simple answer, and I think the most immediate one that we'll all see, is when people are trying to grow a specific area, they don't stop growing the area that's already grown. You know, I see this constantly. It's the people that like want to bring their legs up and they still have like 2 or 3 push days a week and it's like upper body push. Like, why are you still training the shit out of your chest if your quads are small? You know, me and Shallow talked about this. I'm not kidding you. It would have been, me and Shallow had this conversation in November of 2019. We were at Pure Muscle here in Canada. It was me, Shallow, and our friend Cody. We were training legs. And I still have a pretty small upper body. I had a very small upper body at the time because I just did powerlifting and trained legs all the time. And I was complaining. I was like, man, I just wish my upper body would grow. And Shallow said to me, he's like, if you ever wanted your upper body to grow, you'd have to entirely stop training your legs. And at the time, I just took this as like him not being sarcastic. And he was just joking. He's like, you'd have to never train your legs again. And I went, okay. So I stopped training my legs. I didn't train my legs from December 2019 to September 2020. I would do 1 set of squats a week and 1 set of deadlifts every 10 days because I just wanted to know I was still like kind of strong. I didn't care about training my legs, but I was like, can I still deadlift? Can I still squat? And once a week I'd squat and every 10 days I'd deadlift. And I didn't train my legs, do a single accessory movement, did some running, did a little bit of jumping. That's it. And my upper body exploded. And I'm still not very big, but like my upper body grew more than it ever grew before. And Shallow was like living abroad and came back and he's like, what the hell happened? Like, how'd you grow so big? And I was like, we were like laughing because he was showing me photos of like the first pre-script course I taught. And I was like 75 kg. And then he came back and I was like 90 kg. And he's like, what the hell? And I was like, I just eat a ribeye a day and I don't train my legs. And he was like, so it worked. And I was like, yeah, it really did. And it's true though, right? Like what people need to understand is you have a bank account of calories that you can use to recover and your body wants you to recover. The thing is when you have these predominantly developed muscle groups, when you train them, the quality of effort you train them is much greater, right? If you have a really big upper body, you love training upper body all the time. When you go to train upper body, you're going to train at a high intensity. You're going to use greater load. You're going to do more volume. You're going to execute better. If you have small, shitty, scrawny, weak legs and you go train your legs, well, you're not going to do dick all for giving them stimulus. And, you know, in the female population, it's usually inverted, right? It's like they never train upper body and they do glutes 3 times a week. And they're like, oh, I want my arms to grow. And you're like, stop training ass for once, you know? Like nobody's complaining, but everyone's kind of tired of it. It's like the number one reason why you're not growing is because you just won't stop training ass. I'm so serious. My quads are small. Stop training ass. My ass is all stop training quads, you know, and stop trying to make movements, other movements. People, I'm doing this step up for glutes. No, it's a quad movement. And that's why your quads are still really fucking huge and your ass is non-existent. Yeah, it's like, you got to stop, right? And I think people are so avoidant of doing that because I'll go back to emotion again. People are like, I want to bring up my legs, but I don't want my upper body to get small. And you're like, it won't. You don't need to train that. Yeah, I get it. You know, I get it all the time. I get it because I don't leave the gym without doing 100 pull-ups. I do 100 pull-ups every single training session. I train 7 days a week because in my mind, I'm like, oh, I'll be small. And I'm already small, but I'm like, I'll be smaller if I don't do these pull-ups. I'm like, I got to do 100. And it's just an emotional response, right? So, you know, I think people need to realize that it's like, if you have a muscle group that's lagging, you can't add to your program. You just need to reorganize your program. So it's like hamstrings are lagging behind your quads. Look at your program. Can you lower the volume of quads you're doing? Are you doing no quads or are you doing quads? We'll take the quads away. Then it's like, look at the compound movements that you might be choosing or the mid-range movements you might be choosing. And is there massive redundancy in your mid-range movements to where you're constantly still sending stimulus to that muscle you're trying to avoid, right? So it's like, maybe if your quads are overly developed, you need to replace all squats in your program with hinges and just go, well, I'm just going to avoid them altogether. It can't be, well, I'm not going to do split squats. I'll do dumbbell RDL instead. It's like, no, you got to not do Smith machine squat either. You got to take it all out and you got to invert the way you approach training. You know, if you have no lats, this is my favorite one. It's like you have no lats. but your program still looks like a chest and shoulders program, you're going to never have lats. It's not choosing this shortened thing, this better road to use. It's finding a way to encourage more stimulus there and less stimulus somewhere else. So yeah, the number one thing wrong with people's program, if they have weak muscle groups, is they're still training strong muscle groups. Just stop training them.
Yeah, you're so right about the emotional attachment. You're so right. Like, yeah.
We're all there, right? And I think that's where, like, going back to the question of, you know, do barbells and machines have a place? Of course they do. Like, if you want to grow a lagging muscle group, increase all those isolation exercises of that muscle group. If you want to go to sleep comfortably at night, knowing you're not getting weaker or losing muscle mass in this other group, move that muscle group to like a mid-range, low volume movement. So it's like, if I wanted to grow my hamstrings, I'd probably have one hard squat day in a week where the only quad movement was the barbell squat. I'd go in, I'd do 1 to 3 sets of 5 of barbell squat, load a bunch of weight, train at 9 RPE, have it be really hard, and then the rest of the workout would be hamstrings. It's like I go in, I'm sending massive amounts of stimulus to my quads very quickly, but then the back end of that workout is sending a ton of stimulus to my hamstring and volume to my hamstring. So I can maintain the muscle mass of my quads because I'm telling my body we still need these things. But then the rest of my workout, I'm going to make sure all the energy goes to my hamstrings. So, you know, you can still, you know, sleep comfortably at night knowing you're maintaining that muscle mass in that way, but you're not incurring a bunch of volume and taking energy away and sending it there.
Amazing. Yeah. Thanks so much.
Yeah.
I think that is a good one to wrap up on. I think that was, yeah, that was awesome. We have a question we ask everyone who comes on. What is your death row meal?
Oh man. Yeah, that's a good question. So I think my death row meal would be a plate of food from this place in Miami called Palacio de la Jugo, which is basically the Juice Palace. And it's a Cuban restaurant. And for like $20, you can literally get 3 days worth of meat and rice. If you guys ever go to Miami,
bodybuilder's dream, right?
Yeah, if you ever go to Miami, you got to go to Palacio de la Jugo. It's insane. It's very cheap. And you can essentially, yeah, you can just get 3 flat iron steaks and rice for like $15. That would be my death row meal. It's delicious, and you always have something to take home.
And there we go. Who doesn't love a doggy bag, right?
Yeah, of course.
Do you want to tell everybody where to find you, how to work with you, all of that jazz?
First off, just thanks so much for being on here. Like I said, I have such tremendous respect for both of you. I really enjoy what you guys put out. I was glad to have you guys in the course. I think you guys both do tremendous work in your field. Like I say, not a bodybuilder. I don't coach and prep people for bodybuilding, but you guys do tremendous work, and like your names I can always trust to send people to. But if you're looking to talk to me, ask me questions, see me talk about whatever we talked about today in these bizarre rants, you can check out Killian.Hamilton on Instagram. You can check out RX Radio on any streaming platform. And if you are interested in learning more about this, check out pre-script.com for the L1 course. The skill acquisition course goes over all that cognitive development stuff I talked about here. And if you want to work with me on strength, power, recovery, you can always just reach out, send me a DM on Instagram. I'd be happy to hop on a call and chat.
Amazing. Guys, definitely recommend that PS1 course if you are thinking about upskilling this year. When does the next intake happen or course start?
So the next course is starting September 27th. So there's still some time to hop in there. If you need a link, you can always shoot me a message, Killian.Hamilton. But yeah, September 27th, hop into a course all about applied biomechanics and functional anatomy.
Amazing. Guys, thank you so much for listening. Thank you to Killian for joining us. We hope you have enjoyed this episode. Please do give it a thumbs up, positive review, and do not forget to hit that subscribe button. We'll see you all again next week.
Awesome. Thanks so much.